Welcome back to Wellness to Chita Girls. I'm Miss Chita, and this is episode 3, all about mental health. Today with me, I have Miss Turner, high school social science teacher and psychology teacher, Miss Spicer, who is our school social worker, and Anna-Lisa Joyner today, who will be asking all the questions about mental health. Anna.
All right. I just kind of wanted to start discussing like what brought you guys to your profession and kind of where you came from and how you tie mental health into your everyday lives, like the discussion on mental health.
Okay. Do you want to start?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So as a high school social worker, I started 11 years ago in schools, but I, right out of undergrad, went right into Loyola University and got my master's in social work. And I knew at that time that I always wanted to work with adolescents. And I started, so when I was like 22, 23, I was not very much older than the adolescents I was working with, but it was at a community drop-in center. So students would come in after school and weekends, and we did a lot with service learning and mental health support through like games and just interactions with each other after school. And then I went into like clinical, more mental health and clinical setting, and then decided to get into schools because I felt like that was where there was kind of at the grassroots of seeing kids where they are. And in daily, I work with a lot of students who have individual education plans who may struggle with needing additional academic support or mental health support, and then students who might have a 504 plan, which would be a student who has a medical diagnosis and then may need some additional accommodations or interventions and modifications to things, and then also the general ed population. We see students with who might be struggling with anxiety, with depression, with just stress management, just getting through their daily lives. Some need additional supports, and then we also collaborate a lot with our teachers.
Awesome.
I kind of haphazardly fell into it. Originally going to school to be a teacher, and that's just kind of always what I wanted to do. And so social science, it was either going to be English or social science. And so as part of social science, I have to do a lot of psych rotation, psych and so stuff. And that's really where kind of the love of this came into play. And so the more I studied it, the more I wanted to study it. And I really love working with kids. So after I finished my undergrad, I went back and got my first master's in educational administration, and then I studied clinical mental health. And so I just really like what I do. I like, the psych and the social piece together. And so that's what I brought here. And as I was just saying, I'm getting ready to write my dissertation on trauma and how it impacts kids and how they study and how they learn.
Awesome.
Wonderful.
And since you're both mothers, how do you tie your home discussion of mental health into what you bring here, and how do you kind of handle that in a different setting, like other than at school?
Mine's just a little guy. He's only 11. So we sometimes have to talk about, how somebody might be different and how they handle their emotions. And I do know at the elementary schools here in our district especially, with our SEL goals, which is social emotional learning, they talk about things like that. But we do spend a lot of time talking about not necessarily the differences, but that everybody needs their own time, their own space, that we process things differently. And sometimes it's by kind of force. It's like you're going to be out and be a part of peer buddies. I want him to experience what it's like to work with people with different capabilities, different types of ideas, and different levels of functioning. So he's still 11, so we just kind of keep it pretty simple, but depending on what we're dealing with or what we're talking about, we'll go into their brain just works a little differently. That's why they do this, that kind of thing. But the level and depth of his understanding is small.
Sure. But it starts young, and I know because I have a 23-year-old son and then a 19-year-old daughter, and when they were young, they started in their curriculum in their elementary schools. They started like that social social problem solving and like ways to self-regulate, and then they would sometimes come home and say, so-and-so acts differently in class, or they get pulled out all the time, or they have meltdowns all the time. And so we really started to talk with them about what it is to feel frustrated inside or to feel anxious inside and feel like you can't sit in the classroom. So it kind of started then. And then My daughter really struggled with a lot of self-imposed stress of like time management and taking too many hard classes and being involved in all these different activities at school, and how do you help them develop that balance and so that they're not feeling overwhelmed. And so we really talk a lot about mental health and keeping a balance and finding things you enjoy and love doing and exercising and eating well, and that's been a huge part of our family.
And definitely keeping the lines of communication open.
Yeah.
That honesty of I'm not feeling good, or I'm struggling with this, or I'm angry about that, or my feelings were hurt. That line of communication is huge in our house too.
It's just surrounding positivity with discussion and stuff like that
Yeah.
too. Going back to kind of what we discussed earlier, like if your kids notice something at school and point something out, like somebody has like visible issues with mental health, like how would you go about describing someone who doesn't necessarily show that they're having issues, because sometimes it's not always a visible thing to other people. So how can we kind of open up conversation on like the things that we don't necessarily see?
So meaning like if you see a change in their behavior, or like if you notice something different about a friend, or
it's not as
like they're not coming out and telling
direct,
you that I'm feeling bad or anxious, but well, some simple things you can look for is like, is there a change in their eating habit? Are they eating a lot less or eating more? Are they coming to school exhausted all the time, not sleeping well? Are they like not as actively engaged with you, like maybe not texting back or not calling back, or not going out like you typically would go out to lunch on the weekends, and they kind of come up with more excuses, like I'm not really feeling like joining, or I'm not going to go out. I mean, looking for things like that would be some signs that maybe they're withdrawing a little bit more from their typical routine. Those would be some things to look for.
Mrs. Spicer and I are very different lines of defense, and I work very, very hard to keep my classroom door open at all times, as you're aware, before school, after school, during lunch, and so based on the classes that I teach, everybody is, we talk about these are the characteristics, these are the things that you may see, those types of things. And because I have worked so hard from the time you get here as freshmen all the way until, well, it seems like when you're married and have children, you guys seem to be very comfortable to come and talk to me. And so that's how sometimes she and I are different lines of defense. And I'm, as you know, really brutally honest when it comes to me. Often I'll have to say, I need to go, we need to move this forward. And you guys say, I have a concern about, my friend, whatever, Mrs. Smith. And sometimes I'll just say, I'll take it forward. I don't have any problems with that, because you guys, that there's something wrong, but you don't know what name to put on it, where to go from there. So as a teacher, we're oftentimes the first line, and then we refer it back or say, hey, why don't you go and talk to Mrs. Spicer? That's the kind of thing that she's really good at handling, those types of things, because I think a lot of things, I don't say slip through the hands, but they're not aware with the general population that, I see 150 kids every single day where we've talked about these things fairly exhaustively. So it's not, when you see it, or, because I do spend so much time with you guys, I'll say, hey, how's this going? Or what's wrong? Something's kind of off with you lately. And because we do have that environment in the classroom, you guys oftentimes will come in and just see me, or show up kind of unannounced, shoot me an email, that kind of thing, which opens that first step to moving forward.
Sort of taking this in a different route. I think there's a difference between like formally diagnosed mental illness and then just dealing with anxiety. So if you could kind of expand on the difference between.
Sure. One of when you have a formal diagnosis, they will look at intensity, duration, and they'll look at how long you've been experiencing these symptoms, what the intensity of that is, and the impact it has on your daily functioning. It's done through a medical physician or a therapist that has whether it's a licensed clinical social worker, whether it's a psychologist, whether it's a medical doctor, there's the official diagnoses of, say, anxiety or depression. And then from the other standpoint, like we were saying earlier, is that many of us experience symptoms of anxiety or symptoms of depression, but you may not have a formalized diagnosis of that. What strategies and coping skills do you have to manage a day or a night that you might be experiencing high levels of anxious thoughts or anxiety. And then once, if that continues and there's a pattern, then more intensive treatment or therapy might be necessary in order to address those symptoms. You can expand
No,
on that.
and that's, again, in the school setting, for instance, we know that presentations kind of make you nervous. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have, social phobia or that you have anxiety. So they do try to figure out what those triggers or those antecedents are before you go into that formalized diagnosis. But the medical piece, like she said, is the important part. But again, learning to control and learning to reframe your thoughts and how are you working through that. But just acknowledging that, yes, we all have anxiety. We all go through depressive periods, whatever the case may be. It could be seasonal. It could be, something mild, a breakup, that kind of thing. But that diagnostic piece done by a licensed physician or a licensed social worker or clinician is really what separates the two things.
And how do you think we can expand the discussion between peers, especially formalized diagnosed mental illness and just someone who's trying to relate but isn't quite fully grasping the depth of what they're experiencing almost, if that makes sense.
If you said to me, I have anxiety and I'm working through it in several different ways, and I said perhaps I know, me too, but I'm not diagnosed with anxiety. Are you talking about that conversation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
so
you're trying to relate to somebody, but you're not fully grasping.
I think the hard part is in this country, and we were just talking about this in class today, is that there's such a stigma around mental illness that we don't walk up and say, I'm really struggling right now. I have depression and it is so bad. I can barely function. And because we don't talk about, we don't know. So we don't familiarize ourselves with what this looks like. We are much more likely to walk up and say, I was just diagnosed with cancer, than we are to say, I'm clinically depressed. It's just a comfort level thing. I do think that your generation is better with it in terms of verbalizing it, but I think until we really come to terms with mental illness in this country and how we're going to treat it and diagnose it and handle it, it's always going to be difficult. But having those honest, frank conversations about that and really stopping to listen. What is that? I mean, I don't understand. What is it that what are you talking about? What does that feel like for you? And taking that time is a significant thing that will go very far. As Mrs. Spicer said here at our high school specifically, probably in the last 3 years, we've definitely ramped up. What does that look like? Trying to educate you guys with, if your friend says this, what is this going to look like? What might this sound like? How do you respond? Because we don't know. It's not something we talk about. And it isn't even that it's you guys that don't know how to do it as a society. We don't socialize ourselves on this is what this looks like, this is how it's going to be handled. And so if your parents don't talk about it and we don't get you until 9th, 10th, 11th grade, it's an uphill battle. And so we need to have more open, honest conversations, in my opinion, open, honest conversations early on about that. We would, again, with cancer, if, somebody had breast cancer in your family, you would tell every female in your family. If somebody had, prostate cancer, whatever it is, we would be open and honest about it. We need to get to that point with mental health where, yes, I deal with depression and so did my sister, and this is what this would be like. And I think once the awareness comes out that way, we're much more likely to be open and honest in terms of our conversations.
I think the most important thing too is to validate the person what their experience is, and not pass judgment on that, and really try and listen. Really be open to what they're experiencing and what their days do look like and how they're managing. There's not a quick fix. It's not like strep throat where you can go in and get your antibiotic and it's a quick fix. It's how do I live my life and how do I manage with this mental illness.
I know my dad especially struggled with anxiety. He's been going through since he was younger. And I didn't really notice that until he was overseas and coming back, and I think that's when I started kind of understanding his mental health. But I've been dealing with now formally diagnosed anxiety since I was a little kid. So I think sometimes trying to converse with people on what I'm dealing with is almost sort of belittling at times, because you're trying to have a conversation with someone and trying to make them understand how you feel, but at the same time they're trying to relate to you in a way that they don't fully understand.
Sure.
So I think discussion between peers, if you're more comfortable opening up and talking about what you're going through at
Right.
I think that
more
when people
in-depth
divulge
level.
that kind of stuff, too, we have to remember they're not looking for us to fix them.
Yeah.
You know, the worst thing you could say is just be happy. You're depressed,
Yeah.
just be happy.
Yeah.
They're not look. They just want, like she said, just
Yeah.
listen to me and listen to like this was, you know, my heart was racing and this is what was going on, and just having that door open or just listening to what that was like and trying to be empathetic. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize it was that bad, and
Yeah.
you know, how can I help you? How, you know, those are the types of things. But I think that again, it scares us, and we feel like, well, what can I do? What can I? You can't just listen to what I'm saying.
And I do think that people are afraid sometimes to let somebody else know that this is what they're struggling with or this is their diagnosis, because maybe they feel it's a sign of weakness and they
Yeah.
don't want people to pity them or feel bad for them, but yet you still want people to listen and understand what you're going through. But I do think that even like the strongest people struggle with anxiety or depression, and it isn't necessarily a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that we have to continue to be open
Yeah.
with that, and each other.
Yeah.
So,
I think it was hard for me for the longest time not seeing that sort of side of my family, like
sure.
not really feeling like I was able to open up because I didn't see that side of them.
Sure.
But I think like talking to my peers sort of became easier as I started opening up to my family too. Just being more comfortable with what I was struggling with was something that needed to happen. But I didn't really seek help until very recently too. It took me a long time to understand that it was like okay to go out there and just be open and make sure that other people know that it's okay to have this discussion and talk to your teachers and your peers about it.
Sometimes I think it's hard for you to do that with your parents too.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to disappoint them. You don't want them to worry. And so I get a lot of that from your guys' writing. You know, I really feel like I'm really struggling with this, you know, or, you know, there was just one that came in fairly recently about, you know, purging and whatnot. And it's like they just don't want to make that first step forward. So sometimes I think with your peers, it's sometimes easier to have that conversation or with a teacher. And sometimes I think you're looking for that help, for somebody to say, let me go with you. Or I did, you know, I did this and I know how to, you know, take care of this or that kind of thing. So I think sometimes for you guys are at a funny age where we expect you to be adults and yet these are really adult and complex problems that you're afraid to ask for help for.
Yeah. And I think opening up to your peers kind of can segue into being more comfortable talking to your parents about it too. Especially like with Taylor, like growing up, being friends with her and everything, like being able to have that relativity on what we were struggling with mental health wise, I think that opened up a discussion like for both of us family wise too. As far as like treatment goes, this was like a question I wanted to ask. We discussed this during our meeting with Chita Girls, just different treatment approaches and how different treatment options work for different people. Like some people take a very holistic approach to treating their mental health and sort of the benefits of that and then the benefits of going in a medical direction, just in your guys' opinions.
Oh, sure. Well, I always address it from meeting the person where they are, you know, and validating where they are. And some individuals choose to use psychotropic medication. I always find a best practice is to also then be in some form of dialogue therapy. I think that medication alone can help with the brain chemistry component of it. However, you're not addressing then some of the symptoms and strategies to manage your daily life.
Just sort of wrapping it up. So for those who themselves may be experiencing a mental health crisis, or if somebody they know is experiencing a mental health crisis, who can they contact? Just some good resources that you can sort of put out there. How should they go about that without, from a peer standpoint, not damaging that relationship as well?
So as far at our school, we have three social workers, 2 full-time and 1 part-time, Mrs. Bavola, Mrs. Cam, and myself. And then we have 3 school counselors, Mrs. Templin, Mrs. Kirchman, and Mrs. Grimes. We also have a school psychologist, Mrs. Boltice. We have our school nurse, we have our student resource officer, and we have our administrators. That's kind of like the related service team, and then the administrators as well. That's a place to start. Your teachers and trusted staff, like your coaches that you see on a daily basis, that's could be your first person you go to. You know, we've never met. We don't know each other, but you know Ms. Turner really well. You see her every day in class. You may be much more comfortable going to her and saying, hey, this is going on. And then she, like she said, could bring you to somebody who might be able to provide more resources. We have a whole list of resources within our community, from intensive inpatient through weekly counseling. There's talk lines that are available, national talk lines, statewide talk lines that are on the backs of our IEDs. We handed out bracelets at the beginning of the year that have the 1-800 talk line on the inside of that. We're really trying to be very transparent that there are resources available to our students for mental health support. I think it's just continuing to create that buzz and letting people know that those resources are available.
And letting them know that they're not alone.
Exactly.
Like everybody else.
And I think that finding those trusted people, whether they're staff members, your friends, but like you have to build your own tribe, and you have to have people in that tribe that you trust implicitly, that you can have those conversations with, that you can have honest and frank conversations with, because that's your source of support. And having, having a perfect mix of adults and students, but that isn't always going to happen. So identify at least that one person, that point person that you know is going to be there, that knows how to maneuver the system and get you in touch with those people.
I think
That's a great place to end it. Miss Turner, Mrs. Slicer, thank you so much for being here. On behalf of Anna and all the Chita Girls, we appreciate you taking your time and having this open and honest dialogue. I feel lucky to have you at the school. I know our students are lucky to have you, and as a colleague, I'm really blessed to have you. So remember, if you or someone you know is suffering from mental health, there's lots of resources, and please reach out.
Thanks for watching this episode of Wellness with the Chita Girls. I hope that you enjoyed and learned a lot from Anna's important discussion with Miss Turner and Mrs. Spicer, and that you use this video in the future to stay strong and live like a cheetah. If you or someone you know needs help or just needs someone to talk to, come talk to one of our school social workers or counselors, or use the list of resources that is posted on the counselor's page on our school website. If you liked what you saw and you want to see more, watch the last episode here on the channel where Miranda teaches us how to make delicious Buddha bowls. Click the link in the description to listen to the previous episode of our podcast, Cheetah Chats, where some of us talk about friendship. Check us out on social media listed here to stay up to date with what we're doing next and share with us how you #BeACheetah. Bye!